I'm Jennifer Waugh with episode 6 of our News for Jax crime series, Florida Justice Betraying the Badge. Federal investigators now have an eyewitness to murder. Kenneth McLaughlin says he watched Jacksonville Sheriff's Officer Carl Walden kill bank customer Sammy Safar. It is the break they had been waiting for. What happened next triggered stunning developments in the investigation into police corruption.
Carl Walden, police officer who's assigned to the duty desk at this time, I'm reassigning him to his home. I'm also reassigning Reginald Bones and Officer Jason Pugh. I am doing this in the best interest of this agency and this city. I have no further comments beyond that.
It's June 2000. Sheriff Nat Glover announces all 3 officers named by Ken McLaughlin are now off the street. Officer Reggie Bones, Carl Walden's best friend, Officer Jason Pugh, and McLaughlin are called to testify before a federal grand jury. Within weeks, Walden resigns from the department to pursue other professional objectives. Then, a bombshell announcement. Walden, officers Eric Sinclair and Jason Pugh, along with James Swift and Ken McLaughlin, are all indicted.
This is a sad day for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.
The indictment sent shockwaves through the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and the city.
This is one of the darkest chapters ever in the history of our department.
We can't afford to have this sort of thing in the community. I mean, it demoralizes everyone.
Someone that's, supposed to be protecting us, and this kind of thing is going on. It's really scary.
I am outraged by the conduct of these officers. Thank God it was only a few.
Eric Sinclair's attorney.
He intends to plead not guilty and to fight these charges vigorously.
And Carl Walden's lawyer.
We're a little perplexed that they would trust the testimony of 2 cooperating witnesses and little else.
Vowing to fight. Now, as the team prepares to take the officers to trial, one by one, Carl Walden's friends and relatives begin to turn on him. His brother-in-law, James Swift, who witnessed him murder Sammy Safar and then helped get rid of Safar's SUV, pleads guilty to robbery and agrees to testify against him. Officer Reggie Bones, who helped act as a lookout near the bank where Safar was later kidnapped, agrees to take the witness stand as well. Officer Jason Pugh agrees to cooperate with prosecutors and pleads guilty to kidnapping and robbing Bernard Stewart. Officer Eric Sinclair is the last to cut a deal. He pleads guilty to conspiracy in Sammy Safar's death, distributing cocaine, and obstructing justice. October 2002, Carl Walden's trial is in federal court, where no TV cameras were allowed to roll as the man who once aspired to be sheriff of Duval County sat and listened as his friends and former fellow officers took the stand detailing his crimes.
Well, this was a case where there were no fingerprints, there was no DNA. Carl Walden wasn't on a tape recording confessing his participation in these crimes. He wasn't recorded urging someone to lie about what happened. This case was made up of cooperators. Kenny McLaughlin and Daryl Crowden were convicted felons. Kenny McLaughlin had had a drug problem off and on in the past. And so the challenge was the lack of physical evidence, recorded conversations with Carl Walden, and then the challenge of presenting a case with witnesses who are carrying the kind of baggage our witnesses were carrying.
So how'd you do it?
You, as the prosecutor, and the agents who are working the case, you want to be satisfied yourself that the witnesses that you're putting on the stand in any case are telling the truth. You look for all types of records to corroborate witnesses, and you look for consistency, what the witnesses say, like James Swift and Kenny McLaughlin, who were with Carl Walden when he put in motion and eventually robbed and killed Sammy Safar. You have to look at the testimony of those two and see if they're consistent on the critical aspects. In this particular case, you had Carl Walden's grand jury testimony, and you had him identifying Mr. Safar as the victim and Carl Walden identifying the vehicle. And to me, it was an anchor to the case. In other words, to me, it was as good as a tape recording where Carl Walden confessed. It was, to me, better than a fingerprint because Carl Walden couldn't explain how it is he could identify Mr. Safar and his vehicle.
The trial lasted 3 weeks. It took jurors 5 days to sort through all of the charges before finding Carl Walden guilty.
Was there a reason that Mr. Walden did not make any type of statement?
We've got an appeal pending. Our position has been maintaining all along that he's innocent. That's going to continue.
As Walden awaits sentencing, News4Jax was there 22 years ago when his former friends learned their punishment.
Jason, is there anything that you'd like to say about the judge's decision? Mrs. Pugh, this must be difficult for you considering your family and your boys. Anything that either of you would like to say?
No, thank you.
He once wore police blues. Soon he'll be in a prison jumpsuit. Former officer Jason Pugh is sentenced to 5 years in prison for the kidnapping and robbery of Bernard Stewart. Stewart was in court this morning, there to hear and see the cop who terrorized him apologize.
I accept his apology. Yes.
Was the sentence warranted?
I pray to God the sentence will be warranted with him.
Former officer Eric Sinclair was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison. Daryl Crowden, who worked with him to rob Hassan Tahan at the bank, was sentenced to serve 4 years in prison. James Swift, who watched Walden murder Sammy Safar, received a 14-year prison term. Kenneth McLaughlin, the prosecution's star witness, was sentenced to 19 years in prison.
There's no free lunch in this business. You can't expect people to cooperate and not reward them to some degree for it. But we believe that our request and the judge's decisions in the case were measured and appropriate.
Former Officer Reginald Bones was the only officer not sentenced to any prison time. His role was considered minor. He was never charged with any criminal wrongdoing related to a 3-year crime spree committed by his friends and fellow officers. Bones was sentenced to 3 years supervised release for an unrelated bank fraud charge.
Well, just glad it's over. Just glad it's over. It's time to get on with life.
January 27, 2003, 6 years after the crimes began and 4 years after Sammy Safar's murder, Carl Walden is sentenced to 4 life terms without parole plus 121 years in prison. He never took responsibility for what he did. As for why the other officers betrayed their badge,
what motivated Eric Sinclair?
Well, I think what motivated him is what motivated Jason Pugh, and Jason Pugh talked more about this than Eric Sinclair, and I'm guessing it's the same thing that motivated Carl Walden. It was greed. It was wanting easy money. Narcotics detectives were putting their lives on the line every day fighting the drug war, and they were getting paid a salary, but it wasn't a great salary. And while they're out there fighting the drug war, they see the drug dealers who were making money hand over fist, breaking the law. And their view was, who is it going to hurt for us to take a little of that? The drug dealer will still have plenty, and we'll get what is our proper compensation for what we do.
But it escalated.
I think that the robbery of Hassan Tahan on May 15th just sent it into orbit, and it escalated from there to the robberies, home invasion. Mrs. Culp, who had a legitimate job, she was taking the day off from her job. I mean, and Bernard Stewart was a painter. He was a painter. He wasn't a drug dealer. And then, of course, Sammy Safar was a legitimate businessman.
Despite the convictions and sentences, the team of federal investigators wasn't finished yet. They were concerned there might be more corrupt cops within the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Why? During the early stages of their investigation into Eric Sinclair, they suspected someone was covering for him. They learned an inmate at the Duval County Jail had told a detective he had information about Sinclair's involvement in a robbery. That inmate was given a polygraph test to see if he was telling the truth, and he was. But the test results disappeared.
It was missing. It was nowhere to be found.
Did that surprise you?
Well, it did surprise me, and we looked into it. We, of course, interviewed and we used the grand jury to question everyone and anyone who was either working in the polygraph unit or who would have knowledge of what was going on in the polygraph unit. And we were told by one officer that the polygraph had been provided to or given to someone higher in the administration of the sheriff's office.
What did that tell you?
Well, if it were true, it suggested to us that someone higher up in the administration had knowledge as early as May 1999 that Eric Sinclair might be involved or might have been involved in the robbery of Hassan Tahan.
But Sinclair was never investigated and just might have gotten away with it had Clint's team not stumbled upon a conversation 6 months later involving these drug dealers who eventually told them they were paying Sinclair for information about drug investigations. But then, 3 years later, that missing polygraph suddenly reappeared the day after Sinclair was sentenced.
The polygraph was found in the polygraph office in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet that at least one officer had sworn that he had searched the file cabinet for it before, had searched the entire office. So, you know, that confirmed for us that there was something going on. Something didn't smell right. It didn't pass the smell test. And
what did you think?
Well, I thought it was
timing.
Well, I thought it was a setup, that whoever had the polygraph and hid it in the first place didn't want the heat of us looking for the polygraph, and we're hoping that finding the polygraph would satisfy us. But in the end, we didn't get to the bottom of it. We exhausted what we thought were you know, the proper investigative steps, and it's a mystery to this day. I'm comfortable in my belief that somebody was trying to cover up for Eric Sinclair.
There was something else bothering investigators. Why hadn't Officer Sinclair been investigated after Sammy Safar turned up dead in July 1998? He was in charge of security at the bank, was on duty when Safar was last seen leaving with $50,000, and was working when Hassan Tahan was robbed in the parking lot 3 weeks earlier. The team also found something very interesting in the homicide report about Safar's death. Safar's brother had called detectives and told them flat out he believed police were involved in his brother's disappearance. Why? Because after Safar's nephew had been robbed, Safar told his family when he leaves the bank,
he wasn't going to stop for anybody except for the police.
And when Safar's brother found Sammy's SUV abandoned near the bank, his wallet, credit cards, and some cash were still inside, except one thing was missing.
He always carried his driver's license because he had to have identification because of his immigration status. And the driver's license was missing, and it was never found.
His brother knew there was only one reason Sammy would have taken his license out of his wallet. He must have been pulled over after leaving the bank and given it to a police officer.
So Sari Safar was convinced at that point that it was the police.
But nowhere in the 18-page homicide report is there any mention of Officer Eric Sinclair being interviewed as a potential suspect.
There was some suggestion that maybe someone in supervision had told the the homicide detective to just, stand down. But that was never verified. There were attempts made to try to determine if that was true, and it was never determined whether it was true or not.
Clint and his team also suspected there was more to Jeffrey Reed's murder. Reed was the one who robbed Hassan Tahan as his brother Daryl Crowden stood watch. They split the money with Eric Sinclair.
He was murdered on July 10th, 1998, 7 days after Sammy Safar was murdered.
Was that a coincidence?
I don't believe in coincidences, but we investigated his murder. Remember that Daryl Crowden had been advised by Sinclair that the police might be coming after them the evening of Sammy Safar's disappearance and the robbery on July 3rd. And Sinclair told Crowden to tell Jeff, meaning Jeff Reed, to lie low.
But Reed hadn't followed that order.
And he had purchased an old Mercedes-Benz, yellow, kind of stood out. He had been purchasing jewelry, so I think Sinclair was worried that Jeff Reed could be a liability.
Did you ever suspect that a police officer could be involved in Jeffrey Reed's murder?
The timing was suspicious. The way the murder was carried out was suspicious. The way the cars pulled in to block him, much like, police cars pull in when they block a car, and the fact that it was done execution style. If it were a drive-by or some other sort of argument over a drug deal, you would, if there was a shooting, you wouldn't expect it to necessarily be an execution in broad daylight in the middle of the street. In the end, we were comfortable that Eric Sinclair wasn't involved. So there were definitely some facts that made us suspicious that the police were involved, but we were never able to tie any police officer to the murder, and it remains unsolved today.
Code of ethics.
Every new police officer pledges to follow the law enforcement code of ethics, to serve mankind, to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, to respect the constitutional rights of all men to liberty, equality, and justice. These officers not only broke that pledge, but their betrayal 25 years ago was the beginning of an irreparable erosion of public trust in Jacksonville.
We were always the good guys, we were the good guys and they were the bad guys, and now all of a sudden we're questioning, and it hurts.
Did you find that people just didn't trust police as a result of this?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. I mean, it really makes us all look bad.
I think the job's hard enough anyway, without someone coming in and just killing the trust of what I would say the vast majority of policemen are completely legit.
Yeah, the public trust.
I've testified in hundreds of trials, and I can tell you when I raised my right hand and looked at the jury, you could just tell they believed every word you said. That'll never happen anymore.
As a result of the federal investigation in 1999, Jacksonville Sheriff Nat Glover created a special unit dedicated to investigating police officers accused of committing crimes. It's called the Integrity Unit. Detectives Richard True and John Zipperer, along with their partner Dave Blispinghoff, were its first detectives. They remained there until they retired. They are now investigators with the state attorney's office in Jacksonville. Jim Clint became the first assistant U.S. attorney for the Middle District of Florida in 2002 and then became the acting U.S. attorney. He was sworn in as a U.S. magistrate judge in 2007 and retired in 2021. He still runs every day. His wife, Sheila Smith Clint, retired as a special agent in charge with the DEA in 2005 to become the Assistant Federal Security Director with TSA at Jacksonville International Airport. She retired from government service in 2009. They have been married
30 years. Former officers Eric Sinclair and Jason Pugh, along with Kenneth McLaughlin, served their time in prison and are now free. Carl Walden has filed several appeals. All have been denied. He maintains his innocence. Sammy Safar's family filed a civil lawsuit against Eric Sinclair, the city of Jacksonville, and South Trust Bank. The city settled the lawsuit for an undisclosed amount of money. His family was so frightened after his murder at the hands of a police officer, they have never wanted to be interviewed on camera about what happened to him. I'm Jennifer Waugh. Thank you for watching Florida Justice Betraying the Badge.